So this is the session on Kant and Hamann. I'm Wiebke. I'm an assistant professor at Holy Cross's rival university, which is just down the hill, Clark. And it is my pleasure to introduce Aaron Halper. Aaron Halper is a graduate student at the Catholic University of America. He works on Kant's aesthetics and ethics, and his work has been published in the European Journal of Philosophy and Kantstudien, among other venues. It's also my pleasure to introduce Jason Cabitac. He's a PhD student at Emory University, and his work focuses on Kant and German idealism with other interests in the philosophy of art, comparative philosophy, and early modern philosophy. And he's given a series of conference presentations, including on Kant, Schiller, and Heidegger. So we'll hear both papers in turn. I think Aaron and Jason will talk for about 15 to 25 minutes. And then I'll give some brief comments and ask some questions, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you to everybody who's put this together, and to all the participants who have stuck through to, I guess, to close to the end here. So my paper is supposed to be a sketch of the argument from a larger work, which is my dissertation. And I'm here going to give a sort of sketch of the sketch of the argument from the larger work. And the larger work is meant to give an account of the main argument of the critique of judgment as I read it. Which is a notoriously difficult book to interpret. And I think that there are sort of two main challenges to giving an overall reading of that work. And the first one is that Kant introduces the work as trying to or seeking after certain programmatic aims. It's going to bridge the gap between nature and freedom. And it's really difficult to see what Kant means by this. Kant has already done a lot of work to try to bridge the gap. He's already shown, he thinks he's shown at least, that moral action is possible, that's done from freedom, it's still possible to be performed within nature. He's shown that in the first critique. He thinks he's shown already that the moral ideals of the kingdom of ends and so forth can be realized in this world, and so on. And so there are things that it's hard to see what he means by this. And the second problem of reading the book is that then Kant talks about a few different subjects that don't seem to go together. In particular, aesthetics, teleology, and then at the end, culture. So I want to find a reading of the work that both, and I think I have a reading of the work that makes sense of the work as a whole through all of these different parts, and then understands it as actually bridging a gap between nature and freedom. And my understanding of the gap between nature and freedom is that nature and freedom are independent of one another in Kant's view. This is highlighted and not alleviated by the fact that we can do moral action within the natural world. That sort of compatibilism argument. And Kant needs to find a way, he thinks, for nature to serve the end of a moral end, and to serve, in particular, the end of freedom, in order to preserve the primacy of practical reason over theoretical reason, and to show that nature has a kind of moral purpose. And he tries to do this with this topic that he thinks that comes at the end, which is culture, which comes at the end of the work. Culture is a project of improving or cultivating nature, both human nature within ourselves and the nature outside of ourselves. So this is one thing I think I learned from Dr. Wiebke, who talks about the modern project, and in this way, that Kant seeks to find a moral end the end of freedom for the modern project of improving nature, rather than understanding it simply as attempting to alleviate the passions, at which, as Rousseau showed, it failed. It fails to alleviate our passions because it creates new ones in alleviating them. Okay, so if nature can be cultivated to so that it can serve the end of freedom, I think, then the gap between nature and freedom will be bridged. But it seems, sort of conceptually speaking, that it doesn't really make any sense to talk about nature that way. Nature is a blind, mechanistic, law-following appearances for Kant. Freedom has to do with the noumenal, and it's acting in accordance with the noumenal or from the noumenal. It doesn't seem to make sense to talk about them, to put them together. And so my claim is that the teleology and the aesthetics portion of the books, each of them does half of the work of allowing of making sense of culture and the ability of culture to improve nature in a kind of moral sense. Because in sort of roughly, teleology shows us that there are natural objects, organisms, which operate fully according to the laws of nature, but which nevertheless can be understood only by means of an idea, a telos of the organism, which is fully outside of nature in some sense, and is because it's conceptual and therefore outside of laws of nature. And this lays the possibility that nature can be understood as remaining fully nature, as being fully nature, and yet serving an idea that lies outside itself. That's not enough, because it doesn't show us that we can make nature serve an idea that we want it to serve. And that's the role of art. In aesthetics, Kant shows that artistic achievement is able to transform nature so that the artist can use nature to express an aesthetic idea, and one that she chooses. And what's more, the artist's task is structurally identical to the task of transforming nature to serve a moral idea. This is Kant's claim that beauty is the symbol of morality. If we take these two features of these two halves together, the teleology and the aesthetics, we open up the possibility that we can, through our own efforts, transform nature to serve our end of freedom, giving a moral purpose to nature, and I think expanding our conception of nature. Doing this, I think, thereby helps us understand the third critique as answering the question of, for what may we hope? The third question of Kant's philosophy. Kant doesn't talk much about hope in the third critique, but the general idea of hope, I think, is that we hope that the world will be the way that it ought to be. In other words, that there will be an alignment between the way the world is and the way the world ought to be, between nature and between the moral. Kant doesn't rely on hope to make this account in the third critique, because he treats hope there as merely a feeling. Instead, he wants to institute a project whereby we actually bring this about. And we can understand this better, I think, if we think about it in terms of purposiveness, which is the causality Kant talks about, unique in the third critique. Purposive causality is, I think, best understood as a kind of Aristotelian causality, or on the model of an Aristotelian causality. You build a house and you have a purpose for that house, for that building, namely the house, or the living in the house, the income you want from the house. Purposive causality is causality through a concept for Kant, as opposed to say, the sun warming the rock, which is a causality that does not involve a concept, or at least where the concept is not a cause. In purposive causality, the concept is a cause of the thing. And if we're seeking a way for us to, by our own purposive actions, transform the world to serve freedom, then we're asking, can our purposive actions be have the end of freedom, have the moral end of freedom? Can they be caused by freedom as the purpose? And my claim, to phrase the same claim I make about aesthetics and teleology in another way, in teleology, you get half of purposiveness, and in aesthetics, you get the other half of purposiveness. So the organism displays a kind of purposiveness in that it lives in it does its thing for the sake of, or has to be understood as doing its thing for the sake of a concept. The telos of the organism. But it also fails fully to display purposiveness because there's no subject who actually has the concept in the making of the organism. We have to treat the organism as if made by a subject, God, but we have no claim to that. In art, on the other hand, what you have is purposiveness, but without a purpose, without a concept that can be fully understood. You have, thereby, the artist makes the work of art, but there's the aesthetic idea that the artist communicates through the work of art can't be fully grasped, and need not be moral. So each one, right, in order to have purposiveness, an object can be understood purposively when its cause is a representation in a subject who creates the object. And in teleology, you have the representation and you have the object, but there's no subject who makes the organism. There's no little man inside of the plant, the tree that's building the tree. In aesthetics, you have the artist and you have the object, but you don't have the representation. You can't know the idea that the artist has, and that the artist is trying to put into the work of art. And sort of the idea of the paper is that it's putting them together that makes sense of a kind of fully purposive activity in which you have representation and subject and object. So I talked about a little bit about each half here in this work, but not as much as in the larger work that this is all from, of course. And I just make a couple of important points that I think sometimes go missed. So one of them is that in teleology, sometimes the teleology section of Kant is because Kant is saying, okay, we need to understand the organism as made made through teleology and through this teleological causality. But sometimes that's misunderstood as saying it's a teleological causality that replaces the laws of nature. And that's not the case. In fact, Kant thinks the problem is that it's not that you have one instead of the other, but that you always have to have both. That in order to understand the way that the laws of nature operate within organisms, you have to treat the organisms as teleological. And in doing so, you're using both together. And so that's crucial for my argument, because I want to say that when we transform nature through culture, we're keeping nature as nature. Nature remains nature fully. And we're not doing any kind of transformation that is, as we would if Kant had just written the part about art, so it's seemingly incidental to the naturalness of nature. In the section about aesthetics, we have the artist again puts creates the work of art in order to showcase his idea, the aesthetic idea, and thereby transforms the natural thing to represent this idea in some way. And thereby Kant thinks gives us a kind of representation or a way of understanding or of reviewing all of nature, what Kant calls a kind of transformation of nature or a second nature. Through this transformation of nature, we can come to see all of nature as expressing aesthetic ideas, just as art did, just as an artwork does. And because the beautiful is a symbol of nature, or beautiful, sorry, is a symbol of morality, we can do the same thing. This shows us that the activity of transforming nature to serve the end of freedom is going to be structurally identical or structurally the same. And so we will be able to transform the phenomenal realm into what I call a kind of second phenomenal realm, a remaking of nature, so that it becomes rational in the fullest sense, namely in the fuller sense, at least, that it serves the ideas of reason, namely freedom. And yeah, it's been about 15, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Aaron. So I think we'll just move right away to Jason's paper, and then we'll have the Q&A for both afterwards.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining. Good to see you all. The title of my paper is Hamann and the Subversion of Reason, Nature as the Matrix of Revelation and Response. What follows will be a summary of some of the major themes of the paper, and I'll conclude by sketching some of the ways that I think Hamann's ideas are relevant to some contemporary issues. So I'll start my presentation with two quotations. The first one is from my favorite sculptor, Henry Moore. He writes, "Sometimes nature, in overcoming environmental factors, produces growth of an unusual kind. This asymmetrical response of trees and plants where there is insufficient space or sunlight has always interested me. If a tree needs more light, the branches will change direction. If a branch is cut off, it will be sealed and contained. I'm trying to add to people's understanding of life and nature, to help them to open their eyes and to be sensitive. Nature is inexhaustible. How could it ever be exhausted?" Second quotation is from Francis Bacon in his essays. "The first creature of God in the works of the days was the light of the sense, the light of the sense. The last was the light of reason, and his Sabbath work ever since is the illumination of his spirit." So, to consider the relevance of Johann Georg Hamann to the theme of this year's conference, nature and its meanings, I'll first consider Hamann's views on nature before articulating how these views give rise to a particular understanding of and orientation toward meaning. At the outset, it is important to acknowledge that Hamann did not develop philosophical or theological theories per se. Famously, Schelling refers to Hamann's writings as scattered Sibylline pages, written by one who, quote, "did not have a system and did not establish one either." Nonetheless, Schelling, in lectures during the 1830s, insists that Hamann's writings are, quote, "without any question the most important enrichment the literature of recent times has received." This high praise was not isolated, but echoed by such important and influential figures such as Goethe, Hegel, Herder, Jacobi, and Kierkegaard. In the 20th century, Isaiah Berlin commends Hamann as the most passionate, consistent, extreme, and implacable enemy of the Enlightenment, and in particular of all forms of rationalism. His influence, Berlin continues, quote, "upon the romantic revolt against universalism and scientific method in any guise was considerable and perhaps crucial. Insofar as varieties of rationalism remain contemporary philosophical options, And insofar as the relationship between reason and nature remains a contemporary philosophical problem, a reevaluation of Hamann's life and work remains at the very least a relevant philosophical endeavor. Toward the end of this presentation, however, I will outline several of Hamann's insights that I believe can fruitfully address some contemporary problems. My paper attempts to delineate two major themes in Hamann's major works. The first is his ontological prioritization of nature over the productions of human reason. This recalls Plato's classification of techne as a subspecies of poiesis, Francis Bacon's argument that human works can only proceed from the divine works operative or latent within nature, Schelling's late positive philosophy, or similar themes explored in classical pragmatism. Following Bacon, Hamann understands nature in its totality as the book or text of creation, whereas nature in its determinate, historical, and singular manifestations comprise diverse words of God in their temporal utterances. I should mention briefly that Bacon and Hamann are not unique in their emphasis on the word of God. The Gospel of John, the early church fathers, and Origen all reflect preoccupations with the metaphysics of Christ as logos in relation to God as Father. Bacon's innovation was to apply these metaphysical formulations to natural history. He understands the term the word of God, to have temporal and material implications. In other words, Bacon transposes logos from the domain of metaphysical speculation to the arena of history. Hamann adopts this interpretation and emphasizes that these categories are cosmologically inclusive. They thus include such facts of nature as human sensibility and acts of human reasoning. For Hamann, human sensibility as an aspect of creation denotes a relational capacity of human beings to encounter and engage with these words of God. Furthermore, sensibility indicates that human beings exist in a perpetual relationship with God in and through the medium of nature. If sensibility is a relational nexus, then reason, or rather discrete acts of reasoning, are expressions in time of different relational configurations between a particular individual and God. If I am oriented to nature through the concept of creation, or the idea that things and events are words of God, then my activity in the world should reflect the understanding that I am not only addressed by God by the impressions of sensibility, I am also invited through that address to participate in the goodness of creation. From experience, Hamann knows this to be perceptually possible. In fact, such a perceptual awakening was the content of his so-called conversion experience that first inspired him to articulate this vision in contrast to the Enlightenment ideals and presuppositions that he had previously held to be true. In Aesthetica in Nuke, he writes, "The more vivid this idea of the image of the invisible God is in our minds, the more able we are to see and taste, to contemplate and feel with our hands his friendliness in his creatures. Every impression of nature on the human being is not only a reminder, but also a pledge of the fundamental truth, who the Lord is. Every counter effect of the human being in creatures is a letter and seal of our share in the divine nature, and that we are his family." The relative vividness of the idea of God as an actual creator corresponds to the degree to which my perception brings me to experience nature as creation. My activity in nature then arises from the basis of this experience. I see, taste, contemplate, and feel the world around me as aspects of creation or as discrete words of God. Things and events do not exist for me. Rather, they have intrinsic value and worth as rhythmically diverse aspects of creation. From this awareness, I thus engage with them on the basis of this intrinsic value and worth. For Hamann, this openness and vulnerability to things external to me is the precondition for friendship. Since I am an aspect of creation myself, my friendliness toward things is an extension of God's friendliness into nature that proceeds from the locus of my own being. This is what Hamann intends when he claims that we share in the divine nature. This is not a claim that we are God if the copula in that formula indicates identity. Hamann simply means that we have an innate capacity to transmit divine friendliness through our varied interactions in the world. However, we palpably witness God's friendliness when that friendliness becomes actual in nature through our own activity. All of this proceeds from the idea of God as an actual creator and the corollary idea of nature as creation. Human perception, experience, and activity are all transformed in light of these ideas. Furthermore, these ideas root me in a relationship with God through the medium of nature. Insofar as this relational configuration is sustained, my capacity to engage with nature as creation is likewise sustained. However, if I turn away from nature through neglect, attempts to devalue or purify sensibility, or by upholding ideas of nature that obstruct the intrinsic value of things or events, then I also turn away from God. This is also a relational configuration, but one in which reason operates subversively. According to Hamann, reason overvalues itself when it identifies with its powers of productivity and spontaneity. This overevaluation is idolatrous in that the significance is idolatrous in that it hypostatizes the spontaneous products of reason. Thus oriented, reason denies or diminishes the significance of its belonging to nature, inhabiting instead a world of self-generated images and imitations. However, Hamann insists that we cannot escape from our relationship with God. Insofar as we are embedded within nature, we are entangled with God. This is what Gwynne Griffith Dickens means when she characterizes Hamann's work as a relational metacriticism. The intrinsic relationality between human beings and God through nature is the normative basis by which all of our various orientations or stances of reason are ultimately evaluated, judged, and justified. The second major theme extends from the first. Meaning is interpretation. Furthermore, meaning is relational, creative, transformative, and historical. It is relational insofar as meaning emerges in interactions between an interpreter and that which is interpreted. For Hamann, that which requires interpretation is that which is given to me through sensibility. These are the things and events mentioned before, creatures and divine works, that are alive and involved in rhythms of their own unfolding. To enter into a relationship with something else is creative. A project arises to harmonize myself with that which I encounter. How this happens, or what emerges from such harmonization, cannot be known in advance, but is discovered and explored together in relationship. Hence, meaning is creative. Finally, it is transformative and historical insofar as meaning is not only intellectual, but is also reflected aesthetically in the products that arise from meaning making. For Hamann, these products are the interpreter, that which is interpreted, as well as anything that arises from the relations between the two. Thus, meaning has a transformative power, and each factor involved in interpretation re-engages natural and historical processes according to the quality of the transformation. These ideas regarding meaning are expressed throughout Hamann's letters and writings. In a letter written to Kant in late December 1759, Hamann writes, "Nature is a book, a written message, a fable in the philosophical sense. Supposing we know all the letters in it as well as is possible, and we can spell and sound out every word. We even know the language in which it's written. Is all that enough in order to understand the book, to judge it, to make sense of it, to epitomize it? So we need more than physics in order to interpret nature. Physics is nothing but the alphabet. Nature is an equation with unknown quantities, a Hebrew word that is written with nothing but consonants for which the understanding must supply the vowels." In this passage, Hamann delineates the text of nature from its meaning. The former is given in the same way in which letters are given in a text, whereas the latter emerges only through acts of reading, interpretation, and contemplation. This metaphor is significant insofar as it stresses the relational foundation of Hamann's thought, for a text is a medium that brings together an author and reader in light of the possibility of mutual understanding. Furthermore, a reader's discernment of a meaning of a text is not a static exchange. It is rather a reciprocal and living process that proceeds from authorial intention and culminates in the reception and response of the reader. Meaning in this sense is not quantifiable. It cannot be reduced to a proposition secured by logical certainty. Instead, meaning is lived. As lived, meaning is ultimately historical in that it emerges through beings and artifacts embedded within natural processes of becoming and cessation. Throughout his life, Hamann advocates for the humility of reason, a humility whereby reason becomes subordinate to that which is given to sensibility. This orientation does not entail a wholesale rejection of reason, nor does it reflect a basic stance of irrationalism. On the contrary, it recognizes that reason as a concept cannot be adequately understood apart from acts of reasoning that are performed amidst ongoing natural processes that are historically derived and qualified. Accordingly, Hamann argues that reasoning should proceed from an initial starting point of ignorance, as opposed to a starting point of self-derived wisdom or knowledge. Through ignorance, the human individual practices accepting what comes. And through this practice of acceptance, one acknowledges the existential situatedness of all forms of human knowledge. The entanglement of reason with nature through sensibility indicates that human thought and language can only ever be imitative, not creative in an ontological sense. Consequently, reason is obligated to accept and differentiate between facts of nature, which are mediated to experience by sensibility. Insofar as God is understood to be an actual creator, as opposed to a theoretical or abstract concept, nature is conceived by Hamann as the word of God. Sensibility allows us to hear the word of God, which in turn places us in a position where we must not only listen, but respond adequately to that which we hear. For Hamann, these formulations depend upon a fundamental theological premise, namely the identification of nature with the ontological givenness of creation. Nature as creation is not an end product in of itself, but rather the medium by which the human creature is called into a relationship with its creator. As such, nature is the relational matrix duly comprised of divine revelation and human responsivity. For Hamann, human language, both written and spoken, is an immediate and historical testimony to the quality of one's relationship with God. Therefore, language that seeks to purify itself from sensibility has abnegated itself from this fundamental relationship. Such language reveals an individual who actively rejects God's word, which Hamann understands as the gift and invitation of creation. In this light, Hamann's critique of Kant and the Enlightenment elevation of reason can be simultaneously understood as an invitation to return to God. This return requires renewing the significance of sensibility through an engagement with nature as creation. For Hamann, this renewal and return is the motion of faith, which must constantly be reaffirmed through ignorance, listening, and responding. So to conclude, there's 5 brief areas that I'll just point out that I think Hamann has some contemporary relevance. In the domain of ecology and ecological ethics, on my reading, Hamann provides an ecological critique of reason on the basis of his theological conception of nature as creation. The ecology or ecologies of which I am a part provide the context of creation within which reason should dutifully operate. However, human reason should not impose regulative order upon these ecologies because an ecology is not a system. Rather, Hamann suggests that the proper role of reason is to bring things into correct relationship and harmony on their own terms. This requires openness, creativity, and intimacy. The second is pluralism. Since everything that is fundamentally a word of God, Hamann's vision is intrinsically pluralistic. God exhausts himself through nature and scripture, this is a quotation, exhausts himself through nature and scripture, through creatures and seers, through reasons and figures, through poets and prophets. He continues, when one can discern as many truths as the sands on the shore of the sea, here is a small light that surpasses a whole host of suns in splendor. The third is the value of friendship. Friendship for Hamann is a medium of transformation. Sustaining friendship requires vulnerability and a willingness to change. Following Socrates, Hamann understands that friendship in devotion to truth is a supreme good, perhaps one of the greatest human goods. He writes to Kant, "Why are you so aloof and shy with me? And why can I speak so impudently to you? Either I have greater friendship for you than you for me, or I have more insight into our work than you have. You are afraid to expose yourself and to bear the impurity of your intentions or the deficiency of your powers. Think of the brook that shows its sludge to everyone who looks into it. I believe, therefore I speak. You cannot convince me, for I am not one of your auditors. I am an accuser, one who contradicts. You don't want to believe. If you can only explain my notions, you don't even see that your explanation is as idiotic and remarkable as my notions. I will gladly be patient with you as long as I can hope to win you over and to be weak because you are weak. You must ask me, not yourself, if you wish to understand me." The fourth is faith. Hamann's conception of faith as a subordination of reason to that which is given by sensibility is radical. Historically, it is taken up by Schelling in his positive philosophy. This is an important historical lineage insofar as these ideas offer alternatives to conceptions of faith that exclude nature, often to its expense. And finally, fourth is the significance of passion, desire, and the spirit. For Hamann, creation does not only occur outside of us, but emerges through our passions and desires as well. Quote, the perfection of projects, the strength of their exposition, the conception and birth of new ideas and new expressions, the work and rest of the wise, their consolation and disgust in it, lie in the fruitful womb of the passions buried before our senses. Through attentiveness to our own passions and desires, we can become aware of our callings to contribute to creation from the singular historical process that is our life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. It was a great pleasure to read both of your papers and to engage with them. So I won't spend much time on summary, but instead raise a few questions, but just briefly. So Aaron's paper addresses one of the large systematic questions in Kant's philosophical project, namely, how do these three critiques hang together? And he gives a reading of Kant's famous claim in the introduction to the third critique, namely this claim that it bridges the gulf between nature and freedom. He brings into the center Kant's account of culture, which is on this in the part on method at the very end of the critique of teleological judgment. And I thought that gives us makes for a very interesting reading of this claim that Kant is bridging the gulf. I want to raise three questions for Aaron. One is in the written version of his paper, he also discusses a few other interpretations, and he thinks they're in one way or another all not quite sufficient. And I want to ask specifically about how he understands Paul Geyer's and Henry Allison's reading of this claim that Kant is bridging the gulf. And Aaron distinguishes between an emotional support reading of our experience of beauty, an order in nature, and a realizability reading. So on the emotional support reading, our experience of beauty and order give us hope that nature and freedom are compatible instead of in conflict with one another. And according to the realizability reading, the third critique shows the realizability of moral ends within nature. And so my question here is, does Aaron think that the two, Allison and Geyer, see those as alternatives, alternative readings, or do they see them more as part of one and the same interpretation? And I think probably the answer is that it's more of the latter. And so I'm wondering if you think that the two, so the emotional support reading and the realizability reading, they're not compatible with each other and they can't be brought together in one and the same reading. Or if the reason for why you reject them is a little bit different. Okay, and then I two questions about your own reading. It looks like for you, artistic beauty is maybe the paradigm case for how Kant understands beauty's role in bridging the gulf. So I'm just quoting here from your paper. In a work of art, we view the painting of an eagle as expressing an idea, that to the King of Heaven. But once we've learned to understand the painting of eagles in this way, it is difficult to imagine that we do not also apply this mode of view to real natural eagles. So it looks like we have the case of art, and then we view nature in a similar way. But of course, from what Kant says, maybe in the analytic of the beautiful, but also in the analytics of the sublime, just even in the order of presentation, we get, of course, natural beauty first, and then the sublime, and then Kant talks about art. But also from some of the things that Kant says, it might seem like natural beauty is actually the paradigm case. And then we, of course, also have the question of how the sublime fits in. So here's just one case where he seems to stress the primacy of natural beauty. It's a famous passage, so I'm sure you've thought about it. He says, "Now I gladly concede that the interest in the beautiful in art provides no proof of a way of thinking that is devoted to the morally good or even merely inclined to it. By contrast, however, I do assert that to take an immediate interest in the beauty of nature, it is always a mark of a good soul." So this is in the section on the intellectual interest in the beautiful. So that will very much looks like maybe he wants to foreground natural beauty. So this is just how natural beauty, and maybe you want to say some things about the sublime too, but mainly how natural beauty fits into your interpretation. And then I have a similar question maybe about teleology. I think you talked a little bit more about it in this version of the paper. So some of my question I think has been answered, but there too. So in the second part of the third critique, Kant talks a lot about faith and the role of God. And so I'm wondering how those also fit into your picture and how they fit into this account of very much really changing nature in order to fulfill this project of bridging the gulf. And Jason's paper gives us some insight into Kant's criticism of Hamann. And I think this is very welcome, not just because Hamann's rhetoric is kind of fun. In the written version of your paper, you also have a quote where Hamann says that Kant has a destructive mercurial magical wand. So this is about this, where you talk about Kantian reason is sort of spontaneous and inventive, and that being a bad thing. So I thought that was really funny. But also because Hamann's texts are so difficult to understand, and it can be hard to extract very specific points and what precisely he's trying to make there. And then I think you're right that these are precursors to contemporary criticisms of the Enlightenment. And because they're so hard to access, it's hard to track the line of influence. I'm not a Hamann scholar, so I don't know as much about Hamann. I've read some of his texts, and as I also find them very, very difficult. So I'm also just going to raise some general questions here. So my first question is about the picture that Hamann is targeting. I think you do a nice job bringing together criticisms from these different of Hamann's texts and to synthesize them into one picture. And some texts are pre-critical, so they can only be targeting the pre-critical Kant, and then you have texts that are responding to the first edition of the first critique. And so I'm interested in what exactly do you think is the philosophical picture of Kant that Hamann has in mind, specifically when we're thinking about the texts that are published after the first edition of the first critique. Is it that he's questioning synthetic judgments a priori? Or is he questioning the distinction between sensibility and understanding, or intuition and understanding? Or is it more that he doesn't like the notion of nature that we get in the first critique? And my second question is about Hamann's influence. So you talked about Hamann's influence on contemporary views and on Romanticism. And in the end of the version of your paper that you gave now, I think you laid that out even more strongly. But I wonder if there is some influence of Hamann on Kant himself, and whether you think that this is true. So if you think, for example, about what's going on in the third critique, how Kant describes nature's aptness to our faculties, both in the first part, in the aesthetics part, and in the teleology part, whether you think that that has some similarities maybe with the things that you're describing with friendship in your paper, which I thought was really interesting. So if you think that there's maybe a line of influence there from Hamann to Kant himself, and then also on Kant's discussion of faith in the third critique. So if I just quote from your paper again, you say, true faith, according to Hamann, is the assent to that which is given to experience through sensibility. So obviously Kant would say no to that. But here you also have a quote directly from Hamann, where Hamann says, faith is no work of reason and cannot therefore be subject to any attack of the same, because faith arises as little from reason as tasting and seeing. So the part where he says, it cannot therefore be subject to attack from reason, Kant could take that on, right? So I'm wondering if there's some line of influence from Hamann to Kant's later views. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks for those comments.
Oh, I already have two questions here. First question is from Tyler Tritton. So I'm just going to read. You can also just put your name to raise your hand, and then you can.
If you want, I can formulate it.
Okay, perfect, excellent.
Yeah. Okay, great. I should find. This question's for Jason, and I think, like many people, I don't know Hamann either, right? Probably should, but I don't. But I do know a little bit about Schelling. As you know, we've had some correspondence before. You mentioned Schelling in the paper. And so I want to ask a question, see if I can just pinpoint exactly maybe what's at stake, perhaps for Hamann, but maybe even just for you, where is the question not so much a critique of reason, where that means asking what are the limits of reason, what can it do with legitimacy, what can it know, not know, etc., so much as an ontology of reason, asking why is there reason at all rather than unreason. And so reason here, of course, wouldn't be meant in the very specific sense as opposed to intuition or the understanding, but reason here in the very broad sense of why is there even thinkability or knowability at all rather than not. Am I correct in seeing that that's sort of in the background here is a big question?
Yeah, for sure. It's the idea of reason as intelligibility and as an emergent feature of nature itself. So the question then arises for Hamann, because he is so historically focused, these different epochs of human history are often characterized by specific attitudes or orientations or orthodoxies that determine the basic stances of reason and have consequential effects or existential effects on the level of nature, right? So we can see the ways in which, for example, if I look at a field and I just look at it in terms of valuing it for how much natural gas is below the field, then I won't care about the ecology and its role in a greater environment or ecosystem. I'll just go ahead and participate in fracking and do that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think the idea of like the relational metacriticism, the idea that reason is always embedded in nature, kind of obligates a person to evaluate what stances they're taking and the consequential effects of the various positions that they hold to be true.
So does this mean reason doesn't have a transcendental status anymore?
Yeah, so Hamann is the person who influenced Herder specifically on this idea. So it's reason cannot be abstracted from its everyday induction. And so reason has to always do with its embeddedness in events. So it'd be similar, I'd say more similar to someone like James or Herder than it is to someone like Kant. So that's one of the areas of criticism that we can get into later.
Wes DeMarco has a question. Wes, do you want me to read it, or do you want to formulate it yourself?
Thanks for the offer. I could just gloss it. And I would like to say thanks to Jason first, because I also am woefully ignorant of Hamann, and it was delightful. I especially love the burn, as our students would say, the burn in the letters makes it juicy. Yeah, so my question, therefore, is a two-parter to Aaron, and I typed it in the chat. Aaron, maybe you've had a chance to look at it, but I'm trying to think together the two features, the little refinements that you offered toward the end, with the reminder first that teleological causality doesn't replace mechanical causality under laws of nature, understood through schematized categories and so forth. And the second, that this very, I think, potentially quite fruitful idea of a second phenomenal realm, which is the realm of culture and history. I'm trying to think those together. So I want to ask first, is it the case that the second phenomenal realm therefore ought to be susceptible of a fully mechanical account, since you say that both kinds of causality don't go away? And is this a problem, not a problem, what have you? I mean, you sort of spoke of it as if, well, we still have these two, but once we have history and culture, we don't worry about the mechanical part. Well, but we can and should. So that's a first worry. And then closely related, at least as I read it, the understanding living wholes as purposive is, it's the subjective universality of the reflective judgment that sticks with us, right? But in relation to the kind of intelligibility of nature and natural wholes, it's a kind of heuristic, it's a stand-in. And Kant seems to think, as I read it, that we'll never not need that, because it's you can think of it in terms of complexity or what have you, but we'll never have that completely law-governed mechanical account of Keiko or the squirrels outdoors or me or you. And yet, let's say for the per impossibile, maybe we could. What would happen if we could have a completely mechanical account of biological nature and living wholes? Would that mean that the bridge between nature and freedom would disappear? Or would we just all know it's an illusion, but we'll live with this illusion in kind of Dennettian fashion, So they're both worries about fitting those two claims together. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I want to make sure what I say answers your question. I think in the case you're talking about, where we have a fully mechanical account, it's not that the bridge is gone, but that the bridge is constructed. The bridge is complete. It's not like the teleological account disappears out of that picture, because the point is that the laws of nature account only makes any sense within the teleological account. It's only insofar as the teleological account is there, that we have this, that we understand the bird as made for flight, that we can understand the laws of nature as applying there, and that we can even know to apply the laws of flight and so forth. So giving a kind of complete account of the mechanism of the bird's flight doesn't take anything away from that. It doesn't lose the teleological portion doesn't drop out by any means.
I follow you, but think about contemporary debates and applying that. We speak of it as if, well, how about the other case though? How about culture and history? Because presumably you'd say the same thing. It's a nice gesture that you're making here, saying, hey, it's the completion. It's not the solution. We have reductive accounts, mechanical accounts. Hey, we still have the other. Would you give the same kind of answer, the completion answer, to culture and history? Were we to have a completely mechanical account of human behavior and so forth?
Yeah, I guess another way of saying it is that talking about it as a completely mechanical account is sort of is missing the intrinsic teleological character of the thing that we're talking about. If you mean by completely mechanical account, you mean because we understand the mechanics of what's going on, we don't have to make use of any sort of teleological account. Kant just thinks that's misunderstanding the problem that confronts us with organisms, which confront us as teleological beings. Your dog is desiring being who creates him, who somehow has built herself, and I'm assuming it's a she, and is able to reproduce herself and so forth, and heal herself. And these are sort of activities that the dog does qua organism that are intrinsically teleological, and that we're seeking. What we want to do is have a mechanical account of them. That's the thing he wants us to be looking for. That's what it means to do biology, is to give mechanistic accounts to sort of fill in what's happening with teleological accounts. But it can't be a replacement for the teleological account, and even conceptually, I think.
Thanks so much. That's exactly the right answer. And it just, what worries me is that if we were to reach that completion, where you have fully both at full power, nevertheless, it's going to look like an illusion. We just are aware that it's just that the subjectivity and the universality would take on a different quality, I think, at that point. But no, I think the answer you give is the very Kantian one, and I thank you for that.
We have 3 people in the queue. May Sim is next.
Thank you so much. I very much enjoyed both of your papers. They're very delightful, and especially when delivered together in the same session. Let me start with a question for Jason. And this is with respect to your first conclusion about the ecological critique of reason, and how it is that it is important then for Hamann not to impose an order, but rather to bring some sort of harmony into nature's own terms. And I'm wondering how then we could decipher, the terms of the ecological, and especially given the fact that it's constantly transforming in such a way that we could be living in a context within which we might misjudge what the ecological is in its own terms. So how then, might we prevent that sort of error if, there is this ecological that is setting the norm, and, I thought that I had heard you, perhaps, it's my error, saying that the ecological itself is not some kind of a system. So maybe I'm wrong about that, but either way, if you could clarify, how that standard is to be adhered to. And then similarly for Aaron, if it is the case that after the work of art has, expressed the beauty of nature, and yet nature is not transformed, then could we then just have art without any activity? So would the artistic experience, would it be possible to just go out into nature and then just experience the natural world without transforming it in any way, since ultimately the message is the beauty of nature, and that's what we come to recognize? Is it possible to do that without the imposition of any art?
Yeah, thank you for the question very much. I feel like my emphasis for talking about the ecological critique of reason is to just say that the order that would be achieved, or the harmonization that would be achieved through human involvement in various ecologies, would not be derived from one's own reason, but would have to be discerned from actually investigating the constituent components of various ecologies and actually studying the interrelationships between them. So I feel like that's the concreteness with which he is emphasizing this whole relational view. Like, for example, there's a ravine next to my house that is covered with an invasive species called Japanese chafflower, and it grows so quickly that it and produces so many seeds that it can destroy forest floors in just a couple of seasons. So if I didn't know what that plant was, I would not have the awareness to remove it or anything like that. So there is a need to develop intimacy with nature and to develop intimacy with other beings. For example, in human relationships, if I don't have concrete friendships or deep friendships, I can't possibly know how to actually harmonize with them. And so a prerequisite for harmonization is difference. And I take harmonization in a musical sense. You have two notes interacting with one another and they could produce harmony or dissonance. But either way, it's a temporal product. The best improvisers and really know the people they play with, and they can, so I feel like the greater the intimacy, the greater the capacities for collaboration among human beings.
We have 3 more questions in 10 minutes. So let's try to be a little efficient. Next up is Richard Wilkley.
I hope I unmuted. Yes. Well, I thought both papers were excellent and really interesting. I'm going to focus just on Aaron Halper's paper with my question, and I shouldn't take up too much time. But I think you lay out elegantly this twofold way of reading the third critique, where you have teleology on one side as a theoretical account of purpose, using a concept but no subject, and art on the other side is, you might say, in a sense, more practical sense of purpose with a subject, but not guided by a representation or a concept. And you need the two together to understand fully purpose in the sense that concerns Kant as the realization of freedom in nature. Now, there are many subtle and complicated things involved in that. So I just want to ask this question about it. You don't emphasize here, it's probably in your dissertation, which I'm sure I'll read at some point, that in both of these realms, Kant is moving away from a conception of reason as a priori law-giving and turning to what he calls judgment, judgment as reflective, where, an order does not come about now because there is a predetermined category or predetermined law, but order comes about more spontaneously as what he calls a contingent lawfulness, the realization of wholes without explicit design. In the natural organism, the whole develops without an explicit designing element, mysteriously. And Kant says it is kind of mystery. And in the case of a work of art, the inspired artist brings about a kind of whole without an explicit design. He speaks of the associative power of the genial artist as transcending concepts. So, would you say that's an important aspect of your reading of the two parts and how they relate to each other?
I think that is an important aspect. And I wanted to characterize them as each one of those as having because they're sort of contingent in the way that you're talking about, as a kind of failure of the purposiveness that we want at the end. Each is, again, only half the story, half of the apple. And we want to put them together, I think, not just for the sake of, let's say, reveling in a world that is sort of in contingencies but rather for the sake of creating a world in which freedom is sort of fully operative, and freedom as an a priori concept, and that the fact that we don't have that already is really an indication that that's something that we have to create. We have to transform the world this way.
Okay, well, I just say, we have to have human explicit purposes, but at the same time, he's bringing forward that we cooperate in some sense with this realm of contingent lawfulness, which I think is a very interesting situation that he is proposing. Because one usually thinks of Kant as just this, celebrator of autonomous reason, ruling over everything, and instead here in Third Critique, it's more of a cooperative relationship between explicit human purpose in culture. I mean, and you and yourself introduced this notion, very interesting notion, that we will regard the phenomenal world as like an aesthetic idea. So there you would have to have the characteristic of contingent harmony.
I think that's right. And I think one way I might characterize it is instead of sort of moving for this sort of top-down Kant, where you think of them as a priori ideas of reason sort of unfolding, it's much more bottom up. Yeah. You have these contingencies in the world, this unmade world, this natural blind world that is seemingly empty, without ideas of reason to guide it. And so that, so he puts it sort of dramatically, you have like plagues come around and they kill the good along with the evil. Sort of blind to, the nature is sort of blind to our moral purposes. And we want to build up towards this greater end, and create a nature that is not so blind, that is in fact respectful, serving of, and useful of the end of freedom. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you.
This is really interesting, but let's move along. So we have 3 more questions, and May just helpfully suggested that since there's just a business meeting coming up, that maybe we can stay a few minutes extra. So we have Robert Neville, then Edward Halper, and Melvin Woody in that order.
Well, thank you both for your papers. I have a question now that perhaps first should go to Jason, who I know understands something of Confucianism, which seems very alien to this world of the German thinkers. And I would like for you to talk, if you would, about the role of habit in Hamann's work. Is habit, as it is for the Confucians, generally speaking, something that adds the human to nature, where nature includes both heaven and the inner heart and the 10,000 things? Does heaven get reflected at all there? Thanks.
Yeah, the part of the Analects where Confucius is talking about the ways in which the good is mirrored in our neighborhoods, and why would we never want to live in a neighborhood that he's talking about the aesthetic dimensions of good there. And I feel like Hamann is constantly emphasizing that goodness is always reflected in the aesthetic products that we bring forth through relationship. And so the question regarding habit, habit for Hamann would be the way in which learning both extends throughout time, but it has an adaptive element. whereby if I come into something that challenges me or provides a contradiction to a belief, then that becomes the impetus with which I need to develop new habits. Finally, I didn't really get into it too much, but he does have that idea of the passions. And so I feel like that is similar to the idea of the inner heart that you were mentioning, because it's through the passions and the emotions that one is able to actually cultivate this aesthetic view and make it an actual a way of life, in a sense. So,
Thank you.
Edward Halper.
Yeah, thank you for the paper. I have a question, it's mostly to Aaron, but my question is simple, and I'll just state it simply. What is it that we actually can hope for? What is the end that is the end, the purposeness of nature? What is the purpose of the purposiveness of nature? And just to elaborate here, when an artist makes a work, he has some sort of purpose in mind, and then we're somehow to regard not just a particular work of art, but the whole of art, the whole of nature as somehow a work of art that has an end. And that looks, you mentioned in your talk, just mentioned a few minutes ago, freedom, you mentioned justice. That looks a lot like redemption. So it looks like, on your reading of this, the third critique has this kind of infinite redemption as its end, and it leads right to the religion within the bounds of reason alone here. And that maybe explains why Hamann was somewhat opposed to it, because for Hamann, somehow it's here already, and for Kant, it's a work, redemption is somehow a work that's at an infinite extreme.
Yeah, I think it's sort of funny that we're given the same panel, and we have, in a way, sort of opposite papers here. Sort of interestingly, opposite papers. Where Kant is saying, you got to transform nature, make it worthwhile, and Jason has Kant insulting him, wanting him to leave nature alone. It's already worthwhile. I think there's a line that I start my dissertation off with. It's we're determined a priori by reason to promote with all our powers what is best in the world, the combination of universal happiness with the most lawful morality. I think that's the end that Kant wants us to pursue. It's an end. The one word for it is justice, but it's justice in some sort of cosmic scale. All of nature is just. And we have to make it possible, right, we have to make it actual that you get your just rewards of happiness. Since happiness is an empirical concept for Kant, it has to take place within nature. And since morality requires a combination of happiness with worthiness of being happy, it requires that nature be transformed for it. We need nature to be such that you can achieve happiness in accordance with your deserts. Or you can receive happiness at the very least in accordance with your deserts. I think that's the overall goal of the whole thing. That's what we're all hoping for. That's what we're all aiming for. This is sort of, there are other people think it's a little bit different, that it's maybe about achieving the kingdom of ends, which is a higher goal. That's everybody is perfectly moral. I don't know if we're ever going to get to that. I don't think Kant thinks that's possible, even sort of conceptually possible for us to ever achieve something like that. But the goal is really this sort of just world, which you're right, and this relates to Wiebke's question, the last question as well, about the role of faith and why Kant ends the paper with the book with this discussion of proofs of God's existence again. And I'll just talk about that, try to talk about really quickly so we can get to Melvin's question. There are, three main proofs that Kant rejects. There are categories of proofs that Kant rejects, proofs of God's existence in the first critique. The physico-theological proof, the cosmological proof, the ontological proof. And he instead wants us to have a moral proof of God's existence. The worst argument of these was the physico-theological proof, which is the one that says, the world is so beautiful, so there must be God. The world is so orderly, there must be God. But he thinks that's the one that's worthy of respect the most. And after giving this kind of moral proof for God's existence at the end of the third critique, he returns to the physico-theological proof. So, and I think the idea here is, if we can transform nature to be the way, to have this ideal, to embody this ideal of being so beautiful that it must be created by God, that's sort of the goal here. That's the goal of the religion, in a way, and it sort of paves the way for one of the works that's achieved through history and through the religion.
Okay, last question, Melvin Woody.
Well, first, as to Jason, Kant set out to limit reason in order to make room for faith. And it sounds like Hamann is really doing that even more emphatically, but that they're on the same terms there. And then for Aaron, I find your general project really intriguing. I have one suggestion that, if we're to look, is to look at the idea for a universal history and recognize that it's a social version of the natural dialectic of human reason, okay? And you can see where it leads or would lead. So there's a kind of reconciliation going on there, if you take that version of what reason does. The other thing, though, is I can't quite, in my reading of the third critique, as it happens, I kind of come to rest on watching Kant. He's redefined teleology. It's not that the acorn has a concept of the oak tree to get to, but in terms of the immanent teleology of an organism. But he says that's absolutely necessary in order to understand the organism. And on grounds of the first critique, that means it's a constitutive concept. It's a category. And his problem then is, how do you put that together? He can't have it both ways. So he's just struggling with this problem that, he's made mechanism constitutive. He sees you can't understand organisms as long as you do that, and he's just caught, and he never does reconcile. Now, there's some way in which you could say the history of 20th century philosophy is the same predicament, but I will leave it at that. But I can't quite get from that conception to yours, or is it just that I'm coming from a different angle? There's no sense to recommend. I really like your general. I find it very intriguing, and we'll take a closer look at your paper.
I think that's right. I guess I'll start with the second one. That's right about the acorn, and he has this big problem, and his resolution to the antinomy there is pretty unsatisfying, which is, there's a being who has a reason for whom this all works out. With resolutions like that, who needs antinomies? It's not terribly satisfying. I don't think that is actually such an obstacle to his argument. It's an obstacle to some of his accounts. And I want to say a couple things. One thing about it is about the regulative versus constitutive distinction that you're drawing on, which is completely right to draw on it. And my understanding of that distinction is that they're regulative and constitutive are relative terms. He's after all talking about regulative principles and constitutive principles, and principle is a relative term. To be a principle is a principle of something else, of some third thing. Maybe it's not a principle of that. And that's how he can talk about some things as being constitutive principles in one sense, or regulative principles in another sense. And he's pretty explicit about this in the first critique when he talks about the dynamical principles of the understanding, which are constitutive in one sense, but regulative in another sense. The principles in the third critique are merely regulative, I think, because the thing he wants them to constitute is this sort of transformed world in which instantiates this sort of freedom that I'm talking about. And that world doesn't exist. We're supposed to make it. It's supposed to be a project for us. And so for that reason, the principle which is going to constitute it has to be merely regulative.
But then Mel's problem is not resolved, though, right, Aaron? I mean,
No, that's why I started off saying it's a big problem.
yeah, right,
Well,
right.
That's right.
And that's also
everything is resolved in supersensible.
yeah.
Sensible substance.
Yeah, but that was the God thing, but nobody likes that resolution.
It's also why it's autonomy and not autonomy, at least on the side of the judgment, right? So it's a distinction. But yeah, I think he's stuck with Mel's problem, and mine too, I think.
But we're still in the middle of it. I mean, half the stuff that went on the first day had to do with resisting this kind of reductionistic view that everything has to be resolved down into electrons and so on, and a kind of view that would embrace. So the question of, well, thought is all just neuronal electronic activity and so on. That's been troubling. I mean, that's the problem with Dan Dennett, although I do think Dennett has gotten beyond that, but he wants to be sure that it all comes back to something that a computer could do. Well, he gave that up a long time ago, but
we need to be sitting around a table having a nice lunch.
Yeah.
And I miss that with you all. I would enjoy this moment. I just thought I'd say that.
Next year.
Yeah.
At a table with a nice lunch.
That's what we may hope for. There's something specific. All right.
Next year in Milwaukee.
The Wiebke and the speakers. Take care now.
I think May Sim had one more question for me that I wanted to get to. And if you guys, you don't have to stick around for it, but I just didn't want to leave her hanging because she asked this question that Wiebke also asked about the relationship between natural beauty here.
If it were anybody else, I wouldn't stay, but for May, I'll stay.
You better.
So I argue in my work that there's sort of a three-step here to the relationship. That as Kant presents, first you have the pure natural beauty, and then you get the beauty of art, and then the third step is the transformed nature. So in the beauty of art is all about getting that idea, that aesthetic idea from the genius is somehow put into the work. In natural beauty, however, at least the pure natural beauty, nature doesn't put an idea into its creations. It just is. And so finding it beautiful has to do with the relationship with your own faculties, which constitute nature. And it's similar with the sublime as well. It's a relationship with your own faculties, which have constituted it. Although the sublime doesn't play a part in the argument of the work, Kant says. I think he's right. But the pure beauty makes possible, this relationship with your own faculties makes possible the artistic beauty, which I do think is really the culmination of the aesthetics, particularly when it then leads to what Kant calls a transformation of beauty, by means of which he says all of beauty, all of nature and art can be understood as expressing ideas. That's in section 51. So that's the point at which we can come to have a kind of transformed nature. And your question, May, was, can I go back to the pure beauty? And I think the answer is yes, right? But I don't think it's particularly desirable necessarily. It's conceptually first, and it's helpful, but I don't think Kant understands it to be necessarily the best thing we could be doing. Although in the passage that Wiebke cited, he does think there's a kind of moral value to that, but that shouldn't be discounted.
Sure, that's great. Thanks so much. That really clarified things for me.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Is it so the nature to be transformed, is it mainly your own nature on your account, or is it also things like, the pepper garden? Kind of,
What do you mean the pepper garden?
oh, you know how Kant
Oh,
uses.
the plastic.
Yeah.
Um,
Is it nature outside of us too, or is it mostly just our own natures?
I think he thinks that there is a pure first phenomenal world, which is the world that physics studies. And then there's something like a life world or something like that where you actually live, which is a world that the genius, the art in your artistic tradition has taught you to understand and to view in a certain way. And that's the sort of transformation that transformation has already happened for all of us. It's not as though we're sort of there's some sort of peeling back that's possible to think about the world in just this sort of pure sort of as a constituted by the understanding from the first critique. But the world as we sort of experience it and as we live in it is a world that's full of meanings. Right? We see the rainbow and we have meaning. It means all this stuff to us that comes from, Noah and Iris and all of this history of what a rainbow means and what all the colors mean. It's Kant's example, and it's just full of meanings. That's the way we sort of experience the world. It's not necessarily susceptible to the same kind of analysis as the first critique was because, as Dr. Wiebke was saying, it's sort of contingent that I view it more from the Noah side and from the Iris side, the rainbow. But nonetheless, this is the sort of thing I mean by a transformation of nature.
Aaron,
Transformation of our experience.
Would you say at least, and this is my remark is echoing Bob's earlier question about Confucianism, despite that spread and those differences, would you say nevertheless that Kant's reading culture from high culture and recommending that we do so as well?
Kant's reading, sorry, can you say that again?
The way you describe it, it sounds as if we're to read culture generally from high culture. Even though there are differences, it's the work of the genius, it's particular examples of beauty, especially organic form, and so forth.
I don't know if he's saying that. I mean, he has a tendency to argue from the best, right?
Yeah.
Morality, he wants to argue from, here's the pure moral case.
Right.
Everything's going against you and you still did the right thing. So I don't know. I'm sure there's a kind of Marxist account that's possible of this as well.
Sure. I mean, a straight line through Hegel. I mean, I guess it's time for the business.
It is.
But thanks so much. I want to keep going, but good. Thank you again. Gonna run. Take care.
Thanks to all of you for your great questions and your wonderful commentary, Wiebke. Thank you.